The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Queen Camilla walked briskly toward the royal treasury building. Her heels clicked against the ancient stones with unusual urgency. Behind her, 3 men in expensive suits carried leather briefcases and official documents that would change the monarchy forever. Sir Edmund Hartwell, the chief royal guard, watched from his office window as the unusual procession made its way across the grounds. In his 30 years of service, he had never seen the Queen move with such determination so early in the morning. Something felt wrong about the entire scene. Camilla had been planning this moment for months. Ever since Charles had fallen seriously ill and been moved to private medical care, she had been quietly studying the ancient laws and loopholes that governed royal assets. What she discovered surprised even her ambitious mind. There were ways to transfer ownership of royal properties, investments, and treasures that few people knew about. The lawyers she hired were not the usual royal advisors. These were specialists in asset protection and wealth transfer, men who worked in the shadows of high society. They had shown her documents dating back centuries that could give her unprecedented control over the crown's vast fortune. As they approached the treasury, Camilla felt her heart racing. The building housed not just gold and jewels, but also the legal documents that controlled billions of pounds worth of properties across Britain. Castles, estates, art collections, and investment portfolios that had been accumulated over generations were all within these walls. The head treasurer, Mr. Pemberton, was waiting nervously by the entrance. He had received Camilla's orders the night before, demanding access to all financial records and asset documentation. Though confused by the request, he could not refuse a direct order from the Queen. Inside the treasury, Camilla's team worked quickly. They photographed documents, made copies of asset lists, and identified which properties and investments could be legally transferred under obscure royal statutes. The lawyers explained that certain emergency powers existed that allowed a reigning monarch to protect royal assets during times of crisis. Camilla declared that Charles's illness constituted such a crisis. She argued that the crown's wealth needed protection from potential legal challenges, and that temporary transfers were necessary for the monarchy's survival. The paperwork she signed that morning would give her personal control over properties worth more than £3 billion. Meanwhile, Sir Edmund grew increasingly suspicious. He called his contacts in the royal legal department, but found that many of the usual advisors had been mysteriously excluded from recent meetings. The few officials he could reach seemed nervous and unwilling to discuss current royal business. By noon, the first transfers had begun. Camilla's name appeared on property deeds for Windsor Castle's private quarters, several Scottish estates, and a collection of Renaissance paintings worth hundreds of millions. The lawyers assured her that everything was legal and properly documented, but Sir Edmund was not convinced. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown, not just the person wearing it. As afternoon approached, he made a decision that would change everything. He began making calls to other senior guards, retired royal officials, and legal experts who had served the monarchy for decades. What Sir Edmund discovered in those phone calls shocked him. Several other royal guards had noticed unusual activities around various royal properties. Security codes had been changed at multiple estates, and new management companies had appeared on financial documents. It seemed that Camilla's morning visit to the treasury was just the beginning of a much larger operation. As evening fell, Camilla returned to her private chambers, satisfied with the day's work. She now controlled assets that would secure her future regardless of what happened to Charles or the monarchy itself. The lawyers had assured her that reversing these transfers would be nearly impossible, even if other royal family members objected, but she had underestimated the loyalty and determination of the royal guard. Sir Edmund spent that night in his office, reading through ancient protocols and emergency procedures that governed the protection of crown assets. What he found would give him the legal authority to challenge even a reigning monarch if they threatened the institution they were meant to serve. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. Camilla believed she had secured her position through legal maneuvering, while Sir Edmund prepared to use centuries-old guards protocols that even the Queen might not know existed. Neither realized how far the other was willing to go to protect what they believed was rightfully theirs. The next morning brought chaos to the palace as Sir Edmund's investigation revealed the true scope of Camilla's asset seizure. Armed with ancient guard protocols, he had spent the night contacting every major royal property manager across Britain. What he discovered painted a picture of systematic wealth extraction that went far beyond legal emergency powers. Camilla had not just transferred properties to her name. She had also moved massive amounts of cash from royal investment accounts into private offshore funds. The Crown's art collection was being quietly evaluated by auction houses, and several priceless pieces had already been moved to secure storage facilities under her personal control. Sir Edmund called an emergency meeting with the senior Royal Guard officers. In a secure conference room deep within the palace, 12 men and women who had devoted their lives to protecting the monarchy gathered around an ancient oak table. The atmosphere was tense as Sir Edmund presented his findings. Captain Morrison, the longest-serving female guard, was the first to speak. She had discovered that Camilla's team had changed security protocols at 7 different royal residences without proper authorization. New guards, loyal only to Camilla, had been quietly placed at key locations. The traditional chain of command that had protected royal assets for centuries was being systematically dismantled. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed that nearly £2 billion had been moved out of traditional royal accounts in the past month alone. Properties that had been held in trust for the British people for generations now appeared to be personal assets of Queen Camilla. Even the crown jewels were at risk, as new insurance policies listed Camilla as the primary beneficiary, but the most shocking discovery came from Lieutenant Davies, a young guard who specialized in financial security. He had found evidence that Camilla was planning to sell several major royal estates to foreign investors. Contracts were already being prepared for the sale of historic properties in Scotland and Wales. The buyers were shell companies, registered in tax havens, making it nearly impossible to trace the money's final destination. Sir Edmund knew they were running out of time. Once those sales were completed, the assets would be gone forever. He pulled out a leather-bound book that few people had ever seen. It contained the emergency asset protection protocols, established after the English Civil War to prevent exactly this type of royal misconduct. According to these ancient rules, the Royal Guard had the authority to freeze all crown assets if they believed the monarch was acting against the interests of the crown itself. The protocols had never been used in modern times, but they were still legally binding. Sir Edmund would need unanimous support from the Senior Guard Council to activate them. The debate that followed was intense. Some guards argued that they had no right to challenge a reigning monarch. Others pointed out that their oath was to protect the crown as an institution, not just whoever happened to be wearing it. Captain Morrison reminded everyone that these protocols existed precisely because past monarchs had sometimes put personal interests above their duty to the realm. While the guards debated, Camilla was meeting with her lawyers in a private room at Clarence House. They brought troubling news. Several banks had received inquiries about the recent asset transfers. Someone was asking questions about the legal basis for the moves, and a few institutions were becoming nervous about processing additional transfers. Camilla's lead lawyer, Mr. Blackwood, explained that they needed to accelerate their timeline. The window for moving assets without scrutiny was closing rapidly. He recommended completing all major transfers within the next 48 hours. Before anyone could challenge their legal authority, the Queen agreed immediately. She had not come this far to be stopped by bureaucratic delays or suspicious bankers. That afternoon, she signed documents authorizing the sale of 3 Scottish castles and approved the transfer of the royal art collection to a private foundation registered in Switzerland. The foundation's board consisted entirely of her personal appointees. Meanwhile, Sir Edmund had received the unanimous support he needed from the Guard Council. As evening approached, he activated protocols that had been dormant for over 300 years. Legal notices were sent to every major bank, auction house, and property management company in Britain. Old transactions involving royal assets, were immediately frozen pending a formal investigation. The response was swift and decisive. Within hours, banks across London had halted all transfers from royal accounts. Property sales were suspended, and auction houses placed holds on any items from the royal collection. Camilla's carefully planned operation came to a sudden stop, but Camilla was not defeated yet. Her lawyers had anticipated this possibility and had prepared contingency plans. That night, they filed emergency legal motions challenging the Guard's authority to interfere with royal business. They argued that the old protocols were outdated and could not override the legitimate authority of a reigning monarch. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. On one side stood Queen Camilla, backed by expensive lawyers and claims of royal prerogative. On the other stood Sir Edmund and the Royal Guard, armed with ancient laws and an unwavering commitment to protect the crown from those who would exploit it. The fight for control of Britain's royal heritage was about to begin in earnest. The legal battle erupted across London's highest courts as both sides prepared for war. Camilla's team of expensive lawyers filed injunctions in 3 different courts, hoping to find a judge who would rule in their favor. They argued that the Royal Guard had overstepped their authority and that ancient protocols could not override modern royal prerogatives. Sir Edmund, however, had allies that Camilla had not expected. Lord Justice Pemberton, one of Britain's most respected legal minds, agreed to review the case personally. More importantly, he understood the historical significance of the Guards protocols and the danger of allowing unlimited royal asset transfers. The first court hearing took place in a packed courtroom at the Royal Courts of Justice. Camilla arrived in a black limousine, surrounded by security guards and followed by a team of lawyers carrying boxes of legal documents. She wore her most imposing jewelry and maintained a regal bearing that reminded everyone of her royal status. Sir Edmund entered the courthouse through a side entrance, accompanied only by Captain Morrison and a single legal advisor. Their strategy was simple: let the ancient laws speak for themselves. They carried only one leather folder containing the original emergency asset protection protocols and evidence of Camilla's systematic asset seizure. Camilla's lead lawyer, Mr. Blackwood, presented a sophisticated argument about royal sovereignty and the monarch's absolute right to manage crown assets. He cited hundreds of legal precedents and argued that the Guard's actions amounted to treason against the crown. His presentation was polished and impressive, designed to overwhelm the court with legal complexity, but when Sir Edmund's advisor stood to respond, the courtroom atmosphere changed completely. Mrs. Elizabeth Harrington was a constitutional law expert who had spent 40 years studying royal protocols. She spoke quietly but with absolute authority about the true purpose of the Crown's wealth and the historical reasons for limiting royal power over national assets. She explained that the Crown's assets were not personal property but rather a trust held for the British people. The emergency asset protection protocols were created specifically to prevent monarchs from treating national wealth as their private bank account. The evidence showed that Camilla had violated every principle of responsible royal stewardship. The turning point came when Mrs. Harrington presented bank records, showing the offshore accounts where Camilla had hidden royal funds. The money was sitting in banks in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, far from British jurisdiction and oversight. Several of these accounts were linked to companies that Camilla had established months before Charles became seriously ill. Judge Pemberton asked pointed questions about the timing of these transfers. Why had Camilla begun moving assets before there was any public knowledge of Charles's condition? How could emergency powers justify transferring money to personal offshore accounts? The answers from Camilla's lawyers became increasingly evasive, but the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Prince William had been quietly investigating his stepmother's activities and had discovered communications between Camilla and foreign property developers. Email records showed that she had been negotiating the sale of royal estates to overseas buyers for months, long before any supposed emergency. William's testimony was devastating. He described how Camilla had excluded him and other family members from important financial decisions, claiming that Charles had given her complete authority. When William requested to see the documents giving her this authority, Camilla's staff had refused, citing privacy concerns. The prince revealed that he had tried to visit his father multiple times, but Camilla's people had prevented the meetings, claiming Charles was too ill to see visitors. Yet somehow, Charles was apparently well enough to sign complex financial documents transferring billions of pounds to his wife's control. As the day progressed, more evidence emerged of Camilla's deception. Hospital records showed that Charles had been unconscious or heavily sedated during many of the times when he supposedly signed asset transfer documents. Medical experts testified that he would have been incapable of understanding complex financial decisions during these periods. Camilla's lawyers struggled to explain these inconsistencies. They argued that the Queen had been acting in Charles's best interests and that royal medical privacy prevented them from discussing his exact condition. But their explanations sounded increasingly desperate as evidence mounted against their client. By evening, Judge Pemberton had made his preliminary decision. He ruled that the Royal Guard's asset freeze would remain in place pending a full investigation. More importantly, he ordered Camilla to return all royal assets to their original status within 7 days. The offshore accounts would be frozen and investigated by financial crimes specialists. Camilla left the courthouse in fury. Her carefully planned operation was falling apart, and worse, the investigation was now public knowledge. News media across Britain were reporting on the royal asset seizure and the dramatic court battle. Public opinion was turning strongly against her, but Camilla was not finished yet. That night, she met with her most trusted allies and began planning her counterattack. If she could not win through legal channels, she would use her remaining royal authority in ways that Sir Edmund could never anticipate. The fight for the crown's wealth was entering a new and dangerous phase. Camilla's counterattack began at dawn, the next day when she issued a series of royal decrees that shocked even her own supporters. Using her remaining authority as queen, she officially dismissed Sir Edmund from his position as Chief Royal Guard and ordered the immediate dissolution of the Senior Guard Council. She claimed that their actions amounted to mutiny against the crown, but Sir Edmund had anticipated this move. The ancient protocols that governed the Royal Guard included provisions for exactly this situation. Once the emergency asset protection protocols were activated, the Guard leadership could not be dismissed by the monarch until the investigation was complete. The protocols had been written by people who understood that corrupt rulers would always try to silence their accusers. Camilla's next move was even more dramatic. She announced that she was temporarily relocating the royal court to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, claiming security concerns in London. What she did not announce was that her team had already identified several Scottish properties that could be sold to foreign buyers without going through English courts. The relocation order created chaos throughout the royal establishment. Staff members were told they had 24 hours to pack essential items and prepare for an indefinite stay in Scotland. Many longtime employees were confused and frightened by the sudden change, especially when they learned that only Camilla's personal appointees would be allowed to handle financial matters. During the relocation, Sir Edmund realized that Camilla was attempting to move royal assets beyond the reach of English courts. He contacted Scottish authorities and discovered that several large trucks had already left London carrying artwork and precious items from various royal residences. The official explanation was that these items needed protection during the court proceedings. Captain Morrison uncovered an even more alarming development. Camilla had quietly arranged for private security companies to take over protection duties at several royal properties. These were not traditional royal guards bound by centuries of protocol and loyalty to the crown. They were hired mercenaries whose only loyalty was to whoever paid them. The situation escalated when William attempted to visit Balmoral to see his father. Camilla's new security team turned him away at the gates, claiming they had orders to prevent all unauthorized visitors. When William insisted on his right as heir to the throne, he was told that Camilla had revoked his access to all royal properties pending the legal proceedings. This treatment of the future king sparked outrage across Britain. Public protests began appearing outside Buckingham Palace and other royal residences. Citizens who had previously remained neutral in the dispute were horrified to see the heir to the throne being barred from seeing his own father by hired security guards. The media coverage became increasingly critical of Camilla's actions. Investigative journalists uncovered more evidence of her systematic asset stripping, including documents showing that she had been planning these moves for over a year. Foreign news outlets began comparing the situation to historical cases of royal corruption in other countries. Parliament was forced to take notice. Senior MPs from both major parties called for emergency sessions to discuss the crisis. Some suggested that new laws were needed to prevent future royal asset seizures, while others argued that existing constitutional protections had been adequate if only they had been properly enforced. Meanwhile, Sir Edmund was working with international authorities to track the royal assets that had already been moved offshore. Financial investigators in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands were cooperating with the British investigation, freezing accounts and preventing further transfers. The web of offshore companies that Camilla had created was slowly being unraveled. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that several of the foreign buyers interested in royal properties were actually front companies for people with questionable backgrounds. Some had connections to money laundering operations, while others were linked to authoritarian regimes seeking to gain influence in British affairs. This revelation changed everything. What had seemed like a family dispute over royal assets was now revealed as a potential national security threat. Foreign governments and criminal organizations had been prepared to purchase pieces of Britain's heritage through Camilla's secret sales network. The security services became involved, and Camilla's communications were placed under surveillance. Investigators discovered that she had been in contact with foreign agents, who had offered to help her move money and assets beyond the reach of British law. Some of these contacts had ties to hostile foreign governments. Judge Pemberton called an emergency hearing to address these new developments. The courtroom was packed with reporters and government officials as evidence was presented showing the international dimensions of Camilla's scheme. The case was no longer just about royal assets but about protecting Britain's sovereignty from foreign interference. Camilla's lawyers found themselves in an impossible position. They could not defend their clients' contacts with foreign agents without appearing unpatriotic. They could not explain the offshore money movements without admitting to potential tax evasion. Most importantly, they could not justify selling royal properties to criminals and hostile governments. As the day ended, Judge Pemberton announced that he was expanding the investigation to include possible charges of treason and conspiracy with foreign powers. Camilla's actions had crossed the line from family dispute to national betrayal. The Royal Guard's intervention was no longer just protecting royal assets, but potentially saving the monarchy itself from international scandal. The trial of former Queen Camilla became the most watched legal proceeding in British history, held at the Old Bailey under unprecedented security measures. The proceedings revealed the full scope of her betrayal and the foreign conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in compromising the British crown. Camilla's defense team argued that she had been manipulated by sophisticated foreign agents who had exploited her personal financial concerns. They painted her as a victim rather than a willing participant in the conspiracy. However, the prosecution's evidence told a different story of calculated greed and deliberate treason. The most damaging testimony came from Charles himself, who had recovered sufficiently to appear in court. He described how Camilla had gradually isolated him from trusted advisors and family members, claiming to protect him from stress while actually preventing him from discovering her illegal activities. Medical experts confirmed that his illness had been prolonged by medications that were unnecessary for his actual condition. William's testimony revealed the full extent of Camilla's deception within the royal family. She had forged his father's signature on numerous documents, used fake medical reports to justify her emergency powers, and systematically lied to family members about the state of royal finances. Her actions had come close to bankrupting several charitable foundations that depended on royal support. The international evidence was particularly compelling. Intelligence services from friendly nations testified about intercepted communications, showing Camilla's handlers celebrating their success in compromising the British monarchy. Foreign bank records revealed the sophisticated money laundering network that had been created to hide payments to Camilla and move stolen royal assets beyond British jurisdiction. Sir Edmund took the witness stand on the trial's final day. His testimony was brief but powerful, focusing on his oath to protect the crown from all enemies, both foreign and domestic. He explained that the ancient protocols he had activated were designed by people who understood that the greatest threats to the monarchy often came from within rather than from external enemies. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Camilla was sentenced to life imprisonment for treason, with additional sentences for conspiracy, fraud, and theft. The judge noted that her crimes had gone far beyond personal greed to threaten the constitutional foundations of the British state. The legal proceedings also resulted in the prosecution of several co-conspirators, including the lawyers and financial advisors who had helped design the asset seizure scheme. Foreign agents involved in the conspiracy were declared persona non grata and expelled from Britain. Several diplomatic relationships were strained as countries were forced to acknowledge their citizens' involvement in the plot. Recovery of the stolen assets took several more months, but international cooperation ensured that most of the royal wealth was eventually returned. Some money disappeared into untraceable accounts, but the losses were far smaller than they would have been if Sir Edmund had not acted when he did. The offshore companies that Camilla had created were dissolved, and their assets returned to the crown. Charles formally resumed his duties as king 6 months after Camilla's arrest. His first official act was to honor Sir Edmund and the entire royal guard for their service to the crown and nation. New protocols were established to prevent future asset seizures, and the guard's authority to protect royal property was strengthened and modernized. The crisis led to significant reforms in how royal finances were managed and monitored. Parliamentary oversight was increased, and new transparency requirements were established for all major asset transfers. The ancient emergency asset protection protocols were updated for the modern era while preserving their essential purpose of protecting crown assets from internal threats. William's role as regent had prepared him well for his future responsibilities as king. The crisis had shown him the importance of institutional safeguards and the danger of concentrating too much power in any single person's hands. He became a strong advocate for constitutional monarchy and the careful balance between royal authority and democratic oversight. The foreign government behind the conspiracy faced international sanctions and diplomatic isolation as details of their interference became public. The incident became a case study in how authoritarian regimes attempt to undermine democratic institutions through corruption and influence. Operations. Sir Edmund retired from active service but remained as an advisor on royal security matters. His actions during the crisis were studied in military academies and government security training programs as an example of institutional courage and loyalty. He never sought personal recognition for his role but was quietly proud of having protected the monarchy. When it faced its greatest internal threat, the royal guard itself was transformed by the events. New recruitment standards emphasized not just physical courage but also the intellectual ability to recognize complex threats to the crown. The ancient protocols that had seemed obsolete were now understood as essential safeguards against modern forms of corruption and foreign interference. Years later, historians would mark Camilla's asset seizure as a turning point in the evolution of the British monarchy. The crisis had shown that even the most traditional institutions needed constant vigilance to protect them from those who would exploit their power and privilege. Sir Edmund's courage in activating forgotten protocols had saved not just royal wealth, but the integrity of the crown itself. The story became a reminder that loyalty to institutions sometimes requires opposing the individuals who temporarily lead them. Sir Edmund had understood that his oath was to the crown as a symbol of national continuity, not to any particular person who happened to wear it. His actions had preserved that symbol for future generations and strengthened the constitutional foundations of British democracy. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had seen many cases in her 20 years with the Royal Protection Unit, but nothing quite like this. The manila folder on her desk contained documents that had been sealed for over 2 years, marked with the highest classification levels. The case of Queen Camilla's mysterious illness had officially been closed, attributed to natural causes and stress from her royal duties. Sarah picked up the photograph from the file. It showed the Queen Consort at a charity gala just 3 days before she collapsed at Buckingham Palace. In the image, Camilla appeared radiant and healthy, her smile genuine as she spoke with guests. The contrast with what happened next was shocking. The official report stated that Camilla had suffered from severe food poisoning, likely from contaminated seafood served at a private dinner. She had been rushed to King Edward VII Hospital in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, her condition critical. For 48 hours, the nation held its breath as medical teams worked to save her life. When she finally recovered, the palace released a statement thanking the medical staff and requesting privacy for the royal family, but now, 2 years later, new evidence had emerged that changed everything. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the Queen's personal physician, had approached Sarah through unofficial channels. The elderly doctor was retiring and felt compelled to speak about inconsistencies she had noticed during Camilla's treatment. These concerns had been dismissed at the time due to the chaos and urgency of the situation. Sarah opened her notebook and reviewed Dr. Harper's statement. The doctor had mentioned unusual symptoms that didn't match typical food poisoning. Camilla's blood work showed traces of compounds that were not found in the other dinner guests who ate the same meal. Most troubling was the discovery of a rare plant toxin in her system, something that would never occur naturally in any food served at the palace. The detective walked to the window of her office, looking out at the London streets below. Rain was beginning to fall, creating patterns on the glass that reminded her of the complex web of this case. She had requested permission to reopen the investigation 3 times over the past month. Each request had been denied by her superiors, who insisted that the matter was settled. Everything changed when James Crawford, a former palace kitchen staff member, contacted the police. James had worked in the royal kitchens for 15 years and had been present during the dinner that allegedly caused Camilla's illness. He claimed to have witnessed something suspicious that night, something he had been too frightened to report at the time. Sarah had interviewed James the previous week in a small cafe far from the palace. The man was nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder as he spoke. He explained that on the night in question he had seen someone unauthorized in the private dining room area. This person was not part of the regular serving staff and appeared to be handling the Queen's personal wine glass. James described the individual as wearing the standard palace uniform. But something felt wrong. The person moved differently, more purposefully than the usual staff. When James tried to approach and offer assistance, the individual quickly left the area. James had thought it strange, but assumed it was perhaps a new staff member he hadn't met. The breakthrough came when James provided security footage he had secretly copied before leaving his job. The footage showed a figure in palace uniform, but facial recognition software revealed something shocking. The person was Marcus Whitfield, a former palace employee who had been dismissed 6 months before the incident for suspected theft. Sarah studied Marcus's employment file. He had worked as an assistant to the palace event coordinator and had intimate knowledge of royal dining protocols. His dismissal had been quiet, without criminal charges, as the palace preferred to handle such matters internally. However, Marcus had been bitter about his termination and had made several threats against royal staff members. The detective's phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor. The message was brief but clear. "Meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. Bring all files related to the Camilla case." Sarah knew this meant her investigation had reached higher levels of attention. Whether that was good or bad remained to be seen. She returned to her desk and opened Marcus Whitfield's personal file. After leaving the palace, he had struggled to find steady employment. His references from the royal household were deliberately vague, making it difficult for him to secure similar positions elsewhere. Financial records showed he had accumulated significant debt and had been evicted from his apartment just weeks before. Camilla's poisoning, most concerning, were the social media posts Sarah discovered on Marcus's accounts. Though he used pseudonyms, digital forensics had traced the accounts back to him. The posts showed increasing anger toward the royal family, particularly Queen Camilla. He had written extensively about perceived injustices and had shared conspiracy theories about the monarchy. Sarah printed out the most relevant social media posts and added them to her evidence file. One post, made just days before the incident, was particularly chilling. Marcus had written about how some people get what they deserve and mentioned that actions have consequences for everyone, even those who think they're untouchable. The detective checked the time and realized she had been working late into the evening again. Her dedication to this case was consuming her thoughts, but she felt compelled to pursue the truth. The idea that someone had attempted to harm the queen consort and had nearly succeeded was deeply troubling. As she gathered her files to leave the office, Sarah noticed a detail she had previously overlooked. In the security footage, Marcus was carrying a small vial that he discreetly emptied into Camilla's wineglass. The action was quick and practiced, suggesting this was not an impulsive decision but a carefully planned attack. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether she could continue her investigation or if political pressures would force the case to remain closed. Sarah knew that pursuing this case could have serious implications for her career, but she also knew that justice demanded the truth be revealed. She locked her files in the secure cabinet and headed home, unaware that her investigation had already attracted the attention of people who would do anything to keep the truth buried. The game was far more dangerous than she realized, and the stakes were higher than she could imagine.